But if you're wondering, for example, whether it's possible to erase a person from some well-known influential family and do it in such a way that nobody even cares about them, excuse me, I could even use a different word. Yes, it's possible. This video series on abductions includes several such cases, including today's. A really famous person, rich, wealthy, and nobody gives a damn about them. On July 10, 1973, one of the most high-profile abductions in history took place at the famous Piazza Farnese in Rome. And not just in Italy, but basically in the whole world. You see, at 3 a.m. that night, several men kidnapped a teenager. A 16-year-old boy was just hanging out on the street, not suspecting anything. Suddenly he was attacked. They were members of an Italian organized crime group called the 'Ndrangheta. That gang had been kidnapping people for ransom in northern Italy for years, but this particular case was unusual for them. The criminals were convinced they had finally hit the real jackpot. And that's because the guy who ended up as their hostage was a special catch. That night, mobsters kidnapped John Paul Getty III, the heir to one of the richest families in the world. But the bandits didn't realize that for some Getty family members, money would become an issue, much more expensive than the life of a loved one. Many people recognize the surname Getty. It was members of this family who founded the American photo agency that owns one of the largest collections of photos and other media files in the world. You've definitely seen Getty images yourself. But in fact, the story of their wealth and popularity began long before that service was founded. The family's fortune was earned back in the early 1950s, of course, in the last century. At that time, John Paul Getty, the second grandfather of John Paul Getty II, owned Getty Oil, one of the largest oil companies in the United States then. In 1957, Forbes named him Ukraine's richest person. And that meant Paul had accumulated millions in oil money, maybe even billions. No one knew for sure. However, Paul Getty became known not just for his wealth, but also for his notably unstable personal life. There's no other way to put it. Along with his wealth, he steadily gained wives, each one eventually becoming his ex-wife. From 5 different women, he eventually had 5 sons, and from them, he later had as many as 14 grandchildren. But there was one more thing by which anyone could recognize the wealthy Paul Getty. He was a miser. The millionaire or billionaire was so frugal that he installed a payphone in his London home for guests, forbidding use of his personal phone. In short, it's no wonder that the family relationships between the different Gettys were, to put it mildly, tense. True to the classic genre, this story involves not only money, but also drugs and death. One of Getty's sons, John Paul Jr., that is, the second, managed to have 4 sons of his own with his wife, named Gail Harris, before eventually divorcing her, as his father had. Leaving everything behind, in '64, Paul Jr. went to Rome. There, he immersed himself in hippie culture, or hippie, if you prefer. He fell in love with Talita, a model and actress. The couple spent their days together in different ways. However, over time, more and more often, their schedule started to include breaks for weed and then for heroin. And while his father and stepmother were on their trips, so to speak, one of Paul Jr.'s sons, that very same John Paul Getty III, was basically living on his own. And then, when in '71 the stepmother died from a strange overdose, the father left Rome and moved to Britain. Getty III experienced an overwhelming amount of freedom in his life. Since he was young, he was considered a disgrace to his family. Even despite the family's enormous wealth, the boy was expelled from several boarding schools. The media say that he liked to paint offensive drawings on the school walls. Sometimes he would depict the principal in a shameful way, other times he would decorate an entire hallway with his creations. He was inspired to create these after seeing news reports about the Manson family, the same religious criminal subcultural group that was created by Charles Manson. If you haven't heard about it, that's strange, but I'll tell you anyway. Members of this Manson family committed several high-profile murders. The most well-known victims were the actress Sharon Tate and her friends, and she was also pregnant. Overall, Getty III was a typical rich teenager. The guy thought he was better than others, hung out in nightclubs, drank, smoked. In short, he had fun. But what's interesting is that he also earned extra money for all this himself. You see, the teenager sold his own works of art and jewelry. He also earned money by working with magazines. Hetzi III posed for several publications, and it's rumored that he even posed nude, which would hardly be considered legal given his age. At that time, according to another version, the boy was simply an extra. He was also a rebel. He was often seen at demonstrations of supporters of left-wing political views. At one event, the young rich man boldly smashed others' cars and motorcycles. Hetzi III was once arrested for throwing a Molotov cocktail at such an event. Well, such behavior meant at least one thing: Paul Hetzi III could not go unnoticed. As a result, he also attracted the attention of criminals, mafiosi from the Ndrangheta gang. $17 million. That's how much the kidnappers demanded from the Hetzi family for the teenager to return home. Home alive and of course unharmed. But they definitely didn't expect that the first reaction would be just nothing. Hetzi III's relatives assumed it was just a prank by Paul. After all, he had repeatedly said that he wanted to get his hands on his grandfather Scrooge's wallet. What's more, Hetzi III often joked that he would stage his own kidnapping sometime later, just to squeeze some money out of that grandfather. The ransom remained unpaid even after the kidnappers sent the boy's mother a letter with the following text.
Dear mother, I've been in the hands of the kidnappers since Monday. Don't let them kill me.
And the fact that the teenager hadn't been seen by anyone for several days was explained very simply. He had just gone off on another spree. John Paul Sr., the first one, the grandfather, refused to pay, explaining his position like this.
I have 14 grandchildren. If I pay even a single penny, I'll end up with 14 kidnapped grandchildren.
Meanwhile, 16-year-old Paul was being beaten and tortured. For real, all of this was happening in the mountains of Calabria. Day after day, week after week, and then month after month. In November, that is, 4 months after the kidnapping, the criminals decided to raise the stakes in order to finally get what they wanted. That month, the family received something that belonged to Paul. What they received convinced everyone 100%. This was definitely not a prank or some silly teenage manipulation. The criminals sent the family the teenager's severed ear and a lock of his hair. They also included a note.
This is Paul's ear. If we don't receive the money within 10 days, we'll send the other ear too. In other words, he'll come back to you in little pieces.
At this point, John Paul Getty gave in and decided to pay the kidnappers. The stingy tycoon still managed to make a deal with the criminals. In the end, he had to send the mafia about $3 million for the safe return of his grandson. But Hetty Sr. went further, allocating just $2 million for the ransom. And he lent the rest to his son at 4% annual interest. That's how it was. And while old Hetty was figuring out how to save a couple $100,000 more on his grandson's ransom, Hetty III continued to sit in captivity. The boy even spent his 18th birthday in the hands of the kidnappers. But as soon as the mafia got the money, they threw him out onto the street. Paul Getty III was discovered on a snowy highway between Rome and Naples. It happened on December 15th, 1973. Back then, it seemed that the worst was already behind. Paul was safe, and later, thanks to the efforts of the best doctors, he even received a new ear. In addition, his long hair covered that area, so any surgical interventions were practically unnoticeable. 9 criminals, including 2 high-ranking members of the mafia group, were detained. They were supposed to put all of them behind bars. However, the police lacked evidence. In the end, only 2 were punished. Of course, it wasn't the gang bosses. Paul, for these elders, was extremely dissatisfied. However, it wasn't so much that not all the criminals were punished, but rather that most of the ransom couldn't be recovered. Nevertheless, the family tried to move on. 2 years later, Paul III, who was 18 at the time, married the girl he had been dating for several years. In 1975, the couple had a son. They were also raising Paul's wife's daughter from a previous relationship. After the wedding, which effectively cut Hetty III off from the family fortune, the couple settled in Los Angeles. There, they managed to enjoy a brief period of marital happiness. It ended quickly when Paul became addicted to alcohol and hard drugs. He never recovered from what he went through while being held captive by the kidnappers, nor from how indifferent his loved ones were to him. And how much they did care when it came to money. Journalist Craig Copetas, who befriended the heir while writing a Rolling Stone article about him, said the following.
He was using too many drugs. In 1974-1975, there was a court hearing in Los Angeles that, as far as I remember, focused on having relatives and/or a group of lawyers take legal control over Paul's rights. Given his addiction, he was strongly opposed to it.
Paul Getty III reached 25 in a drug haze, until he suffered the fatal consequences of that life. One day, he took a deadly cocktail of Valium, methadone, and strong alcohol. His body just couldn't take it. Paul had a stroke and his liver failed, but in the end, the doctors managed to save him. But Hetty III was left disabled for life. He was paralyzed. He also nearly lost his sight, quote from his godfather, the boy.
All was gone, except his mind.
He spent the rest of his days in his own house in Beverly Hills, which, thanks to his grandfather's wealth, was essentially converted into a high-tech private hospital. Paul was cared for by his own mother. Here is another quote from the same journalist, Craig Copetas, or Copetas.
I wasn't at all shocked by how things turned out. You could understand everything from the very first day you met Paul. The guy was talented, had his own methods, and was interested in various things. For example, he wanted to be a director but didn't want to apply to film school. Paul would never have taken on such responsibility. That was the sadness.
The irony of fate is that only after a stroke and paralysis did Hetty III try to make the most of what was left, to try to live in a new way. For example, he even ordered a special attachment for his wheelchair so he could go skiing. Imagine that. Here's what Paul III's son Balthazar said about him in 2011.
He never let his disability stop him from living a full life. He was an inspiration to all of us, showing how to stand up to any adversity.
John Paul Getty III died on February 5, 2011, at the family estate of 2,500 acres, surrounded by his family. He was 54. Well, that's about it. Well, in the end, I just want to say one thing, and don't let your disability stop you from living a full life. Well, I don't let it, you see. I'm lighting a fire for myself. Thank you for watching. Share your thoughts on the story. I find it very interesting. Especially, I don't know. Well, in a way, it's sad that there's a family like that. On the other hand, you have to admit you're not really surprised by these rich people. Maybe I have a biased, prejudiced attitude. Honestly, I'm not surprised they didn't even look for him, guys. Anyway, see you tomorrow. Stay healthy. Thank you for watching. Come back to the fire and we'll keep listening to stories. Already tomorrow. Thank you.